Why do we keep hearing coded language like Black Americans are lazy, they're difficult, they complain too much, while immigrant populations are framed as the model minority? They're more manageable, they're more educated, they're more professional. These are the discourses, and that's not unintentional. This conversation is not about any kind of xenophobic discourse about immigrants taking jobs or anything like that. Like this ain't that, right? This is about American institutions and their historical preference when it comes to Black labor and Black identity. There is a large body of research within labor studies, sociology, history, and migrant studies. There's a body of research. They perceive some groups as less politically confrontational, less historically rooted in the U.S. racial struggles, and less likely to challenge structural inequities. These are the groups that American institutions prefer. This is not just some random knee-jerk reaction opinion. This is established research. This is what they say. My conversation today is going to be an analysis of that and the ways in which we see this show up is with regards to, say, for example, deindustrialization, right? And the choice for corporations and for American institutions to decide to offshore its industry, to basically excavate a fundamental part of the American economy and offshore it for cheaper labor. Not just that, not just the decision by American institutions, but with the blessing of the U.S. government. So now you're removing the manufacturing jobs that became a staple for the American advancement economically. To make a decision for institutions for the government to agree to that. And not just to agree to it, but then allow for those same goods to be brought back into the United States after having been made in foreign countries and to be, mainstreamed back into American societies with no penalties. Explain that. Like that's a whole other conversation. Like that's a whole nother episode in and of itself. But let's for the sake of time, deindustrialization is one example, right? The civil rights rollback. We're seeing that now. We just had the Voting Rights Act gutted. We see across the South all of the struggles and the fights and the treachery that was imposed upon our people, on our ancestors, those who lost their lives, those who were politically imprisoned, those who were beaten and humiliated for these rights. And then to have those just taken away just like that. But so much of the civil rights rollback are happening right in front of our eyes. So let's remember, what I'm saying is that there's a preference that American institutions have when it comes to Blackness. There's a preference. And that preference isn't Black Americans. Why? Because, we're deeply rooted. We're foundational to the American experiment. We are foundational to it. You can't remove us from it. We know it. We know nonsense when it shows up. We know injustice when it shows up. And we have the gumption to call it out. Labor restructuring, the ways in which labor is restructured across the globe, the ways in which, the multicultural corporate identity politics, right? And lastly, and most importantly, the dilution of Black American historical claims, the erasure of Black American culture, progress, advancements, right in our face, right in real time, and using various peoples under the umbrella of Black identity to speed up those attempts at erasure. What happens when the very people whose ancestors risked their lives, risked their freedom, risked economic advancement, risked everything in essence to build and help build the political foundation for the modern civil rights that everyone benefits from today? What happens when these people become framed by the society that it was pushing back against as the problem? Why do we keep hearing coded language like Black Americans are lazy? Let's think about it. They're difficult. They complain too much. While immigrant populations are framed as the model minority, they're more manageable, they're more educated, they're more professional. These are the discourses. And what happens is, media is a monster. I talk about the ways in which media and the ways in which Hollywood and media are able to frame and shape how people think. And it's a global, sort of a global phenomenon. So click here if you want to see more about that video and the ways in which media, social media, Hollywood, etc., has done a really good job of framing Black Americans in a certain light. Like they push the images of us that fit their narrative to the forefront, and they hide, other narratives, or they don't speak on them, or they don't publicize them, or they don't promote them in their medias the way that they do the sort of the debaucherousness. And they do the same thing with other groups that were like, they the so-called model minorities and other, immigrant groups that they find more palatable. They tend in general to dissuade us from looking at the images that exist in their countries or in their communities that are similar to the ones that they highlight about Black Americans all the time. But I've traveled. So as someone who travels, I know that in every country, every single group of people has people, communities, and people within those communities who are less desirable, who are not as motivated, who are not as aspirational. Although our media, if you were to just listen to our media and look at how we are framed in popular discussion, this is what you would think about us. And that's not unintentional. So just to provide some historical context, because it's important that I ground this argument in really important historical context, right? Black Americans are, as we all know, but it's important to contextualize where I come from in this conversation and where so many of us, where we are situated in this discussion. Those of us born post 1964, we are the first generation of Black Americans born with all of the civil rights of the United States. That's important to remember. That's important to acknowledge. And we got those civil rights not because of the goodness of white folks. White folks came to their senses and said, we've mistreated these people for centuries, and we need to do right by them. No, it came because Black folks risked their lives, and they struggled, and they worked, and they pushed, and they pressed, and they made an international outcry, and they were strategic, and they were organized, and they were dedicated, and they were resilient. And as a result, they transformed the United States to and for and by which everybody who is not European are allowed to migrate into the United States and benefit from those laws and those civil rights. The idea of democracy was a myth prior to the civil rights and the Black Power movements. Okay, so you say this is the land of liberty? You say this is the land of democracy? Okay, prove it. Why are we in these conditions? And they were doing it in such a way that the whole globe paid attention to it. And as a result, the United States had to do something because the geopolitics at the time was very sensitive. Geopolitically, you had the USSR jockeying for positions. You had nations across the globe decolonizing and kicking out European rule and rulers and replacing them with Black and brown and various other so-called minority rulers across the so-called third world, across the so-called global South. You had these transformations happening across the globe. In the United States, they were brutally mistreating the Black Americans in broad daylight. And every news channel on the globe was pointing to this. So this is the context that the civil rights movement emerges. It emerges because of this historical context. But after these victories, after the civil rights victories, came deindustrialization. And I just pointed out what deindustrialization was really about. It was really about pulling the rug up under Black American communities who had built communities and, reinvented themselves through the Great Migration and the labor movements that came as a result of the various manufacturing industries across the United States. But then to allow that entire manufacturing infrastructure to be excavated out of the United States and offshore somewhere else for other folks to benefit from, and hence the emergence of China. But that's another conversation. That's another conversation. That's not, and this is not a shot at China by no means, right? Like, China did what they probably should have done. They took advantage of the stupidity of the United States by offshoring its manufacturing industry. And China took it and absorbed it. All across Southeast Asia, all across Asia, they found ways to absorb it. And now look at the end result. But see, that's not the point. The point is, after the civil rights era came deindustrialization, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, a brutal surveillance industry, and the dismantling of our Black political infrastructure and institutions and organizations, the imprisonment of Black leaders, the political imprisonment and the assassination of Black leaders, and on and on and on. And, I talk about a lot of this in another video if you click here on the impact of the counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, its impact on Black leadership organizations, particularly the 1950s through the 1970s. Click there if you want to learn more about that and its impact on Black communities. So I set the stage for this discussion about employer preferences and immigrant labor. All right. So as I mentioned, these are interdisciplinary works that, traverse across, labor studies, sociology, history, migrant studies, etc. And so you have, books and authors and researchers such as Roger Waldinger, Mary Waters, Philip Cassinetz, Rule Rogers, Camille Charles, and a whole lot of others. And so we'll discuss the findings like that. What they found was that some employers view Black immigrants as more compliant, more ambitious, less political or less politically confrontational, and, different from Black Americans or from, so-called African Americans, right? So these scholars, right, that I just mentioned, they interpret this difference as racialized perception, not objective truth. This is not something that is just fundamentally true. This is a racialized perception. This is a perception, right? And we have to understand and unpack what is informing these perceptions. What is driving these perceptions? It is always white supremacy. I stand on that. You can't understand anything culturally. You can't understand anything politically. You can't understand anything historically in the United States without attaching it to white supremacy. I don't care how uncomfortable people are with that. That's what it is. That's what it is. I understand it makes people uncomfortable. I wish there were other things that we could talk about. I wish we would have dealt with that in the 1960s. I wish we would have invested in ways to really deal with white supremacy, right? And anti-Blackness. I wish we would have invested in that at the pivotal point of the civil rights movement. Instead, we overinvested in Vietnam. We took all of those resources that were designed to really address what was happening, and we invested in Vietnam. And then Reagan came along, and then we gutted what we were supposed to have invest with during as a result of the civil rights legislation. Reagan gutted it out. He just took it. He just completely eviscerated it. So as a result of that, we still have to have these conversations in 2026. So again, what employers often reward when it comes to, these racialized perceptions is it's not Black excellence. It is political quietness. It is a complacency. It is a fear of having to go back to your country. I'm not saying that. The research tells us that. They understand that. American institutions understand that. They understand the value of the American citizenship. And as a result, folks understand the consequences of having to give that up. And as a result, also, people who come from environments that are far more harsh for them than the US are much more willing to embrace and be embraced because of the difference in their country and the difference that they've been positioned from us, or that they've been sold about a difference. But then every now and again, we see the immigrant and the African Black being treated as just Black. And that will continue to happen because of white supremacy. So you can fool yourselves if you like, but the realities are the realities. So America increasingly uses the word Black in a global, multicultural sense, while disconnecting it from the historical experiences of Black Americans, those of us who are the descendants of enslavement and Jim Crow. So you have, for example, you have the hip hop globalization, you have the ways in which diversity is branded, you have various representation through media, through corporatism, various immigrant success stories and narratives, right? But the descendants of the people who endured slavery, lynching, segregation, redlining, state violence are increasingly treated as a mere option, an optional subgroup within a broader global Black category. As if our ancestors weren't the ones who drove culture, who drove musical innovation, who drove innovation in medicine, yes, medicine, in law, yes, law, in engineering, yes, engineering, and physics, yes, physics. See, when people talk about Black culture, they want to limit us to sports and music. No, Black culture academically, Black academics is one of the most undervalued of so many of the undervalued aspects of our identity and what we've contributed. Here's the thing, look at it like this. We have about, in the United States, you have about 120 historically Black colleges and universities in the United States that are still open. Most of them opened the late 1800s, early 1900s. So over 100 years, over 150 or so years, between 150 to 100 years old, these historically Black colleges, with every sort of discipline across the various HBCUs, primarily focused in the South, in the southern states. What's my point? So you mean to tell me that these historically Black colleges and universities graduated people and they didn't go off into society, go off into their fields and do extraordinary things? They only contributed to music and basketball, football? That's it? That's what historically Black colleges and universities, 120 years of it? No, it's stupid to think that. It's stupid to think that Black folks have contributed to everything. And in many respects, they broke the ground in everything. So much common medical practice today that was started by Black physicians. Groundbreaking Black lawyers, folks like Charles Hamilton Houston. We all know Thurgood Marshall, but there is no Thurgood Marshall without Charles Hamilton Houston, the founder of the law school at Howard University. These people were brilliant. All right, so I digress. My point is this. This is about how using those same tools to further disenfranchise Black Americans, to further, erase our contribution in our history, to further and to replace us with a more docile group that won't be critical of them the ways we have been in the past. This is about that. This is about that. And then creating these differences so that we don't become aligned and that we don't become allies. That's what this is about. In this divide and rule, politics has always been central to racial governance. So you had slavery, you had poor whites versus enslaved blacks during the period of enslavement, right? You had ethnic labor segmentation, right? You had, segregated platoons during the Civil War, during the First World War, during World War II, during the Korean War, during the Vietnam War. You had segregated platoons, like literal segregation, fighting a war for freedom and democracy in America in segregated platoons. If people actually think that these people have changed, what? How did they change? When did they atone? When did they do any sort of, reparations? When did they pay? When did they issue any kinds of public apology, like formal state-sponsored public apology with reparations? Never. So how they change? We see them every day. We see their ancestors. We see their offspring every day. They all around us every day. They are the people who just voted to gut the Voting Rights Act. They're the people who are instituting and implementing and going out and doing the work of ICE. This is them. In conclusion, Black Americans are not merely another demographic category. We are foundational political people who struggle transform the United States. Let that breathe. Let that breathe. And then I'm going to say it again. Black Americans are not merely another demographic category. We are foundational to the political infrastructure, to the cultural infrastructure, we are fundamental to these here United States of America. When a society benefits from your culture, your labor, your language, your music, your resistance, and your political sacrifice, because damn it, we sacrificed, while simultaneously reframing us as we the problem? We the problem? We the ones going all over the world, bombing nations and funding genocides and, you know what I'm saying? And destabilizing governments and excavating resources from sovereign nations. We doing that. We the ones dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We the ones that starting, world wars and global skirmishes all over the place. We doing that. We the problem. You're not witnessing inclusion. You're witnessing a historical displacement. And to all our brothers and sisters who come from immigrant countries, y'all need to wake up to this. We understand. Just like y'all, just like people who come to the United States, get to establish, their cultural traditions, their foods, their flag, their customs, their song, their dance, their dress, their this, their whatever. And any encroachment on that is a violation. A Ghanaian can't overstep the bounds of Nigerian culture and tradition. It's a violation. Y'all don't get to do that to Black Americans. Just like we get to establish our culture, our traditions, you don't get to make caricatures out of us. Anybody who does that is in violation. Simple. If every group gets to do it, if you telling me that Black Americans don't get to do that, that's it for now, y'all. Peace. Up quick to shut it, don't wet it. Real niggas some shots with this canoe. Yo, what up, yo? Time is running out. It's real, though. Let's connect politics,